Welcome to the Week 8 Steel Scorpion Sports Podcast. I'm half your hosting team, Jeff Miller.
I'm Mark Heffel.
And Mark, we're through 8 weeks of the NFL season, so this week's podcast, we're going to do our NFL halfway point recap. But before we start into that, how about, now that we're through the Sunday night games here in Week 8, why don't you give us a gambling recap? Knowing that we're still missing the results from the Monday night game of Dallas and Washington, but we fully expect Dallas to win that game.
Yeah, fully expect Dallas to win. I'm going to go ahead and say that Dallas is 7-1, Washington is 2-6. But the gambling results for Week 8 through the Sunday night games, the favorites this week were 7-7, and the overs this week were 7-7. So right at 500, Vegas is just showing off now. They're just flaunt the fact that they know what they're doing and that it's hard to bet against them. Year to date, the favorites are 59, 58, and 3. About as close to 500 as you can get. The overs are now 64 and 56. And if you remember from last week, I mentioned that the primetime overs, so the Thursday, Sunday, and Monday night primetime games, the overs were 18 and 4 for the primetime games. As of last week, and I was saying, maybe you want to keep riding that train, but then I was like, well, maybe, things are going to regress towards the mean, so maybe now is the time to start betting the unders. Well, hopefully you ignored that part of my thought, because on Thursday night, the Chargers and Broncos went over the number, and tonight, the Packers and Saints went over the number. And both of those games had high numbers. Those two games were 2 of the 3 highest over-unders of the week. In fact, the Packers-Saints was the highest number of the week. I think it was 55, and it still sailed over. It was 67 points in the game. So primetime overs are now 20 and 4, and then for tomorrow night's Monday night game, the over-under is currently sitting at 49.5. So if you're one of those that believes in these streaks, then go ahead and bet the over and assume that it's going to be more than 50 points.
Yeah, if you can hang on, I'm going to quickly call someone about tomorrow night's over, but I'll be right back.
Yeah, I'll give you a sec.
But on top of that, I will say, you mentioned Vegas was just showing off. I don't like to brag too much. Maybe I do. Either way, I thought Vegas was clearly wrong on one of the lines this weekend, and perhaps I took advantage of it. It was the Buffalo-New York Jets game. They had the Bills on the road, and I know they were down 2 running backs, and I know Kyle Orton's the quarterback, but the Bills were a 3-point underdog at the Jets. And I heard a lot of talk from the Sharps that said everything points to the Jets winning this game. This is a great spot for them. But I've looked at that Jets defense. It's pretty horrible. And Geno Smith still is the quarterback. And I know people were saying he played his best game of the year the week before with New England. But I just couldn't see how the Jets should be favored in any game. Their only win is against the Oakland Raiders. That to me seemed like easy money. And perhaps I took advantage of that.
Well, that was, a good theoretical bet by you, I guess. Taking the road out there. But Geno Smith clearly is a Jekyll and Hyde situation that you were, I guess, fortunate to get, the Hyde side of him or the Jekyll side. I'm not sure which is which, but clearly he had a great game against one. I shouldn't say great. By Geno Smith standards, he had a great game against New England. He didn't have any turnovers, so right there, that's a victory for Geno Smith. But this week, wow, 2 out of 8 with 3 interceptions. If my math is right, that means he completed more passes to the other team than he did to his own.
I do like to say, had he been allowed to complete that game, he probably would have ended up with more completions to the Jets than to the Bills. I'm going out on that limb.
The key word there, though, is probably, because we just don't know.
I couldn't guarantee it, and I wouldn't have laid money on it, but I did think it probably would have happened. But then, lo and behold, in comes Michael Vick, and he just tore it up. I believe, Mark, he was about a 50% quarterback in his completion rating. He had a fumble and an interception, did not lead them to too many successful drives when it mattered. So quarterback controversy might be overstating things in New York. I think more what it is a dearth of talent at the quarterback position.
Yes, absolutely. And the Jets clearly will be picking towards the top of the 2015 draft, and they'll have Michael Vick. He is a veteran towards the back end of his career. He's clearly not the future for the New York Jets. Geno Smith, someone that they just took in the second round of the 2013 draft, they kind of need to figure out if he's the answer or not, or maybe they've already decided, because I'm hearing that Michael Vick has been named the starter for Week 9. So if that's the case, you got to think that maybe they're going to be looking QB at the top of next year's draft.
Yeah, but that's probably enough talk about a mediocre to bad Bills team and a horrendous New York Jets team. So let's move on to other exciting topics. You did mention, also in your gambling recap, some of the overs and some of the high numbers that were being posted. There was quite a bit of scoring this week in the NFL, especially by a couple teams in particular. The Patriots proved that they have not left the building, and I'm sure you saw that Tom Brady is back in his MVP form from a few years ago. They put up a pasting 51 points on the Chicago Bears, who could have gone one of two ways. After last week, the arguing in the locker room, the dissension in the team, they could have galvanized, come together, and played a great game, or they could have just fallen apart and basically sold their season down the river. And I think we know which way they went.
Yeah, the Bears are looking like they're in trouble at 3-5, and all the infighting. They've definitely got some problems, especially with the stacked NFC. We'll get to the looking at the NFC playoff picture later, but there are a lot of good teams. There's going to be at least one good team that gets left out, and the Bears, I think, are going to get left out, but they're not one of the good teams that I'm referring to. They have the potential to be a real good team. I think they still need to address some defensive issues. Obviously, giving up 51 points today, and their offense should be better. I mean, when you look at the talent that they have with Cutler, Forte, Marshall, Jeffrey, a good tight end, and Bennett, they've got talent. They should be putting up 30 points a game or more, but obviously, maybe an issue with QB. He has some turnover issues. I don't know if you probably didn't see this, and I don't know how anyone that's listening to this can come back and find it, but I was watching the beginning of that game, and the Bears' first possession, they had a 3rd and 19, and Cutler's back to pass. He doesn't find anyone that's open. He has zero pressure on him. Okay, there's no one near him. He throws the ball purposefully at the feet of Forte, so it's not intentional rounding, and walks off the field. And I saw that, and I thought, I had to rewound it. I have to see this again to make sure there was actually no pressure on him. Zero pressure. And I think it was kind of Jay Cutler's way of, because Jay Cutler's kind of the gambler, like he'll throw into double coverage, but he has turnovers. And I think he got chided for those turnovers last week. And I think it was kind of his way of saying, like, look, that's kind of how I do things, and sometimes it works and we do well. But if it's 3rd and 19, obviously I'm going to have to make a long pass here. I might get intercepted. So you guys are telling me to not have turnovers. So we just literally threw it into the ground and walked off the field. And I was like, wow, that's saying something. There's an issue there.
Yeah, I didn't see that, but that is if it went down exactly as you said, that's pretty crazy, and Jay Cutler may be part of the problem, not the solution in Chicago long term. But obviously New England has figured out its pass protection woes that were plaguing them in the early part of the season. They've gone from being a punchline after that Monday night thrashing in Kansas City to being one of the top 2 or 3 teams in the AFC again, which most of us expected going into the season. Obviously, putting up 51 points on anyone in the NFL is pretty impressive. That goes back to the 2007 Patriots type of offense where they found weaknesses and they just exploited them the entire game. So, got to watch out for them as the season progresses. I'm not sold that they're a Super Bowl team, but definitely they're going to be in the mix for the AFC playoffs again, which we talked about last week. Funny thing is, they weren't the only AFC team to score 51 points this week.
Yes, the Steelers as well. Before we leave the Patriots real quick, I have a couple of tidbits. I think that the New England offense today was kind of led by Jonas Gray and Brandon LaFell, which I think is pretty much all what everyone was predicting before the season started. Clearly, that those two would be some of the best players. I found it odd that the Patriots scored 51 points despite getting a combined 3 catches for 19 yards out of Julian Edelman and Danny Amendola. So that's kind of crazy. That's 2 of their, Amendola is kind of maybe washed up at this point, but Julian Edelman was their leading receiver last year. Clearly did nothing in today's game with 1 catch for 14 yards. And then the passer rating, I think, not most people know how the passer rating works. Probably 99% of NFL fans. I've heard roughly how it works, but when I look at the stat line, Tom Brady was 30 out of 35, for 354 yards, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions. He had as many touchdowns as incompletions, and his rating was 148.4. I think a perfect rating is 157.3, but how exactly do you get better than 30 out of 35 for 354, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions, and no sacks? How is that not a perfect rating?
Well, he did have those 5 incompletions.
Yeah, I guess that must be it.
Didn't average 20 yards per attempt either. So there's some room for improvement there. So Tom, if you're listening, really got to work on something for next week. Maybe throw the ball a little further down the field and not let it hit the ground.
I guess so, because he missed the perfect QB rating, but his QBR, ESPN created stat, was a 98.8 out of 100. So that clearly shows that he was not quite perfect, apparently, but pretty close. But going on to the other game that you mentioned, the Steelers with their 51 points. Roethlisberger, speaking of good passing lines, what a performance that he had today. 522 passing yards, we're tied for the 4th most passing yards in the history of the NFL, and he actually had it with 5 minutes left. The Steelers got the ball back, and they just, they ran out the clock, because they probably should at that point with a 17-point lead. But I was kind of wondering, do they realize how close he is to a record that's been around for more than 50 years? Maybe they should, kind of go for this. The craziest thing about that stat is seeing that the record was 1951. It wasn't even really a passing league. It makes you wonder, how did someone throw for 540 plus yards in 1951, and it hasn't been broken in all these years? The career passing yardage record has been broken. The single season passing yardage record has been broken a few times, and yet this record has stood since 1951. Can you explain that?
Well, I believe that was the first person ever to attempt a forward pass, and the defense had no idea what to do, so they'd continually get the ball at the 1-yard line, and they would just make this long drive in 2 or 3 plays because they would just throw the ball over people, and the defense was like, what's he doing? You can't do that. That's my guess.
You could be honest with there.
But I do think you're right. I mean, Roethlisberger, when they got the ball back late in the game, had they known that he was that close, he would have had no problem shredding the Colts defense for another 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 yards, whatever he wanted to do, because all day that's what he was doing. And I know Vontae Davis was out for part of that game, but the Colts defense, which had come in on a high, shutting out Cincinnati, and was ranked as one of the top defenses in the league, they were just shredded in Pittsburgh. Ben he was moving the ball at will. It was embarrassing, truly, for a Colts fan. Would you say, Mark?
It was, yes. And as Colts fans, we are clearly hoping that this is an abnormality and that the defense plays more like the defense that held the Bengals to 0 points than the one that gave up 51 points today. I'm assuming that, Monte Davis being out hopefully had a lot to do with that, but definitely some room for improvement there. They have one extra day this week to get ready for the Monday night game against the Giants. Hopefully we'll see some improvement there, and then they have the bye week to maybe address a few things, but clearly there are some issues there to be fixed.
Yeah, and I think this goes to show again that in the NFL, you can't predict the Super Bowl winner after the first 3, 4, 5 weeks. It's helpful. It gives you a guide as to who might make the playoffs, but a lot of it comes down to who's playing well at the end of the season. Because the Colts, and this happened to them last year, looked really good through the early to mid part of the season. A couple key injuries last year derailed them. And this year they also were good in those 3, 4, 5, 6 games. But you want to be playing your best in weeks 15, 16, 17, I'd imagine. And speaking of playing well, and you just mentioned the Cincinnati Bengals and their inept offense against the Colts last week, they have been the opposite of playing well, except for when they play the Baltimore Ravens. Apparently, if Cincinnati could just play Baltimore, they'd be undefeated, and they would have 16 fourth-quarter comebacks.
Yeah, well, a strong sample size from 2 games, but yes, if you could extrapolate that over 16, that would be the case if it continued to hold. But yeah, Baltimore's got to be kicking themselves because they're 5-3 with 2 blown fourth-quarter leads to the Bengals. So take those away, and you're looking at 7-1 with that one loss being to the Colts. That will now there's a dogfight for the AFC North. It's crazy. People look at how bad the NFC South is, and we'll get to them later, but AFC North is just the opposite. Every team is above 500. You've got the Bengals, 4-2-1, Baltimore and Pittsburgh both at 5-3, Cleveland at 4-3. 4 teams above 500. As a quick aside, we talked about the primetime overs hitting, and it just dawned on me as I'm talking about the AFC North. Baltimore and Pittsburgh play each other in next week's Sunday night game. I haven't seen what the over-under is. I'm assuming for that series it's usually low. I remember a year or two ago when those two teams played each other, the over-under was like 32 or something ridiculously low. Those games are usually low-scoring, close games that come down to a field goal or something. But if that game goes over the number, or even if it goes like over 40 points, then at that point just the floodgates are open. Just bet the overs in all primetime games for the rest of the year, because if that game goes over 40 or 45, then clearly something supernatural is happening.
Well, there is a primetime game before that, Mark, and it, as with all the Thursday night games, it would be a divisional game, and of course this is the week that it switches back to the NFL Network. So no longer will CBS have the co-hosting duties, should I say, but they will move it back to the NFL Network. And it's to your point of the primetime overs. This one I would be a little worried about because the Carolina Panthers are in it, and the Carolina Panthers can't score. That was on display again today, which was pretty impressive. A field goal kicker's delight that allowed Russell Wilson one touchdown drive late in the game to win the game, because seriously, Cam Newton and the Carolina offense were only able to put up 3 field goals in the entire game.
Yeah, that's a good point as far as the over-unders this Thursday night. It'll be interesting to see what the over-under is for that game. Carolina couldn't get into the end zone today. New Orleans obviously has a pretty good offense, especially as they put on display tonight against the Packers. But as we know, they are a different offense on the road, so definitely can't expect them to put up, the 35 to 40 points on the road that they usually put up at home. But speaking of these over-unders, makes me think of something else. We did that 3-week contest while Bill Simmons and Cousin Sal were away from their over-under podcast, so I guess the over-unders for each game. Now, in general, we were usually fairly close to the number. We were usually no more than 1 or 2 points away from the point spread for a given game. But I'm thinking, that's fairly easy to do, or at least you can make some educated guesses based on the strengths of the teams and knowing, which are public teams like the Cowboys and the Steelers and et cetera, where Vegas is going to want to see the number. But imagine how hard it would be if we actually tried to do that for over-unders, because it's just something that you don't inherently think about as far as, and there's no national bias. You can't factor in the fact that, the Cowboys are a public team or the Steelers are a public team and then they get more money than average. Over-unders are, you can't do that. There is no, public groundswell behind certain over-unders for teams. It's just, they set the number what they think it is. I think that would be, and maybe we shouldn't do it because it would be pretty comical. Maybe it would be, fairly off. We might think the over-unders going to be 40 and it ends up being 52 or something, but that might be an interesting experiment to do, even if it's for 1 week.
It may be, and as long as you let me go first and take 47.5, I think it'll be a fair contest.
47.5, I think that's the typical or the average over-under for a game.
It may or may not be. I'm just saying, if you let me take that, and yes, that tends to be about the midpoint for average games in the NFL. So, yeah, if you let me start and go with 47.5, I really like this contest. But obviously, there is a deviation away from the mean every game. Some games, like tonight's game, would have had a much higher line. Some games, when the Jets are involved, would have a much lower line. But on average, it comes back. So
I don't know why you're saying if you go first to 47.5, because we're not going to do this Price is Right style, because then we would just continually have 47.5, and then I think it's over. I'll take 48, or I'll take 40.
I want to call under by a half point on you every time. I thought I was going with the $1 strategy.
No. We're not doing the Price is Right. We're the same as before. We each look at the games, come up with the numbers, and then compare them to the real numbers. But
fine.
We have to think about doing that.
Well, maybe if we do that, cousin Sal and Bill will mention us on their podcast or in their mailbag.
Yeah, we started a new trend. We started a new guess the over-under podcast.
It's still a line. It's just the over/under line.
True. Exactly. We may have to give this some thought. Maybe we may have to investigate this.
All right, I'll get my patent lawyers on it right away as well.
Okay.
All right, so anything else from Week 8 that you wanted to touch on before we get to the halfway point of the NFL and the NFC playoff picture?
There are a couple things, a couple quick hitters that in the history of the NFL, there's been 3 games with no punts. One of them was in 1992, and now there have been 2 this year, both involving the Packers. So I think that's just kind of a sign of the times, if you will, about how prolific these offenses are and how protected the QBs are. That we had, it happened once in the first, 100 or so years of professional football, and then twice this year. It'll be interesting to see if it happens again this year or as soon as next year. Another quick hitter is Sammy Watkins. He seemed like, a good, respectable wide receiver. I did not necessarily think he was in the same class as Deshaun Jackson. If people remember my rant on Deshaun Jackson from a week or 2 weeks ago. But Watkins had a clear breakaway, long TD, 80-plus yards. They started celebrating him too early, so he's hot down a little bit. He slowed down a little bit. He put his fingers in the air, like the number 1 sign as he's running toward the end zone. Little did he know there was actually a defender close behind him that caught up and tackled him at the 5-yard line or something like that. So I'm sure that he will learn from the learn going forward, and probably got an earful from his coach. And then one more quick hitter was the end of the Lions-Falcons game for this morning. I don't know if you saw it. The Lions came out to attempt the field goal, 43-yard field goal, and they missed it. But then the rest of the flag came out to delay the game. They didn't get the snap off in time, and then they had to kick a 48-yard field goal. And they made it and won the game. And it got me thinking, there's so many penalties that the other team can decline. If they know we decline the penalty, we don't want it for various strategic reasons, whether it's because they don't want to give them another 3rd down for a chance to get a 1st down, or based on yards or where they're in the field. It seems like, why couldn't you decline this? I mean, this is literally the most critical define or accept situation there is. We're talking about 3rd or 4th down or 10 yards here or there. We're talking about literally winning the game or losing the game. Why can't the Falcons come and say, nah, we declined the delay of game, we're fine? I mean, I guess if you decline the delay of game, then maybe you're saying that they still get another chance from the 43 or something. But it seems like, since they missed the field goal, the Falcons should have some kind of resource or recourse on. Did you see that game?
Yeah, in fact, I only saw the ending of that game because the conventional wisdom of having games in London, England started, something akin to 6 a.m. out here on the West Coast, makes it a little harder to see the beginning of the game. But I did see the end, and I will say the reason that you don't have an option to decline that is it's a dead ball. There was no play. The clock should never have started, so there's still time on the clock. So if you declined it, I guess you could say, no, we don't want to move them back 5 yards. But the clock would not have started. They'd still have the time left to do the play. So, of course, you would always push them the 5 yards back. But it does seem odd that at the end of a game, the last play could be a delay of game after a missed field goal allows you to kick the field goal again and make it to win. It seemed odd. It seems like there should have been some option that they could have a 10-second runoff instead. Now the game's over, but that isn't in the rule book. The rule would be delay of game means the play never started, so the clock hasn't begun, can't keep moving, so there's still time on the clock. Do you want him to kick a 43-yarder or a 48-yarder? And the crazy part about it is that's Matt Prater, who missed the 43-yarder before the delay game, the most accurate kicker in the NFL, until he puts on a Detroit Lions uniform. And then no one apparently can kick a oblong ball through the uprights anymore. It's just amazing how horrible their kicking situation has been this year.
Yeah, it's been really bad. And seeing that in the end, it was thinking, feeling bad for the Falcons fans, just thinking like, man, I thought they had the game won, and then except for, half a second or 1 second late on snap, they lose. It's one of those situations where it just seems like he's going to decline that because originally we were saying that if the Lions had done their job correctly and snapped it a half second or a second earlier, he probably still picks it the exact same way and misses, and the Falcons win. But because of the fact that they were negligent in their duties and did not snap it in time, then they got to win the game, as it turned out. So it's kind of a weird situation. And I mentioned before, too, that until that kick, actually the second kick, the Lions had not had a successful field goal all season long. It was in the 40-yard range, so between 40 and 49. So their first one of the season ended up being a winning kick right at the buzzer.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned feeling sorry for those Atlanta fans that saw the team win and lose. The good news is none of them were probably in attendance. Those people you saw wearing Atlanta Falcons jerseys at Wembley Stadium were probably given those as a gift. They have no idea who the Atlanta Falcons are. And they were probably more interested in the Newcastle 2-1 result that was going on simultaneously, or the Man U Chelsea game that was being played at Old Trafford later in the day. In fact, I believe there were cheers at odd times during the football game, and it's because they were posting the other football scores, the soccer scores from the Premiership. So that's nice for the NFL.
You say this, and yet I read an article today saying that the NFL, they had 3 games in London this year, and they've had 2 already, and it's going to be a 3rd. But I read today that they have plans for 5 games in London next year. So clearly, your scenario is not true. Clearly, every single one of those persons that fan is a diehard fan of the NFL. They're just clamoring for more NFL. And before you know it, we're going to have, 7, 10, 12 a weekly London game. It's getting kind of out of control. I don't know if there's eventually going to be a team in London. It seems like it would be kind of difficult just with all the travel involved and the road trips for the teams. Every team that goes over there has to buy a week, the week after, if they kind of continue with that tradition. Logistically, I don't see it happening for the next few years. And clearly, I think you got to put a team in LA before you put a team in London. What do you think?
Yeah, I would think the second largest TV market in the U.S. probably would be ahead of one of the better markets in Europe. And as you mentioned, the travel would be an issue, and many of the other logistics, the costs. The pound is much stronger than the dollar, so it actually would be really hard for that team to be competitive, I would imagine, because the free agents would not want to move to London. It just seems like there's a whole can of worms that would open up. And by the way, you mentioned that the NFL would go from 3 to 5 games, and at some point they'll probably go to 6 and 7. There is a novelty to the games right now, where we used to have 1 game, then we went to 2 games, now we're going to 3 games. At some point, they're going to hit that diminishing return point where these British fans are going to be like, yeah, this is neat, but you're doing it during the Premiership League season. I'm going to go watch the real footy, and I'm not going to worry about these NFL games because they happen every week now. So NFL's got to be careful of that. You don't want to saturate the market too fast because, honestly, American football is not even close to number 1, number 2, number 3 over there. I believe football, cricket, perhaps rugby, maybe Formula One, all would rank ahead of the NFL in London.
The thing you got to be careful of is that it could come as soon as next year where they stop caring because I mentioned one more game in London this year. It turns out that game is the Cowboys, who are currently 6-1, or as we said at the beginning of this podcast, 7-1, as of tomorrow after the beat Washington, versus the Jaguars, who are 1-7. So you have a 7-1 team versus 1-7. As of now, anyway, I think the game is still a few weeks away. But that game clearly could get out of hand. That game, if Dallas, if they don't show pity and if they keep running DeMarco, if they decide that they want DeMarco Murray to break the single-season rushing record, they may give him, 30, 40 carries in that game. Clearly, they'll be way ahead at halftime, and they just got run out the clock, and they want to get DeMarco Murray 250 yards or just let him name his number that day. You could be seeing, kind of a 60-something to 7 scenario, and then the fans of London might say, this is crap. This is not exciting. This is no fun. And then all of a sudden next year, no one shows up. So we'll see.
Well, I think that'd be more fun than if it were, say, the Raiders and the Jags playing over there in a 3-0 game. But I see your point, and yes, we got to be careful of, one, giving them any bad quality games, which I think we've given them a lot, and two, of oversaturating the market. So good luck, NFL, but maybe focus on the U.S. market. So anything else from Week 8, Mark, that you wanted to touch on before we jump into what will be an exciting halfway point discussion?
Yeah, I think I covered all the quick hitter items, and now we can get into the AFC and NFC playoff races. I'll let you start first and go ahead and pick a conference.
Yeah, so we've mentioned the AFC playoff race in a couple of different podcasts, so I'll just quickly touch on that. I don't think we have to rehash it too much, but for weeks now, you and I have been saying there are 5 teams that are pretty well locked into playoff spots, and there'll be a battle for the 6th. Those 5 would be the Patriots. We said the Ravens as of last week, the Colts, the Broncos, and the Chargers, and then we said the Bengals or the Steelers, maybe the Bills or Dolphins. At one point, we may have even mentioned Houston or Kansas City. Those teams will probably be battling out for the 6th playoff spot. And Cincinnati maybe righted ship today, but maybe not. They don't get to play Baltimore anymore this year, so that could hurt their chances of getting more wins. But I think we're pretty safe on the AFC side, knowing that the division winners will be New England. One of the AFC North teams obviously will win. Maybe Baltimore or Pittsburgh is more likely. The Colts, and then the Broncos, after beating up on the Chargers, look like they're the class of the AFC. So I don't
one thing I'll say on the AFC real quick, though, is that typically the NFL has half the playoff teams are new each year. So the 6 playoff teams from each conference, on average, 3 of them were not there the previous year. And yet, if you look at the AFC, the 5 teams that we mentioned, 4 of those 5 teams won the playoffs last year. The one that was not was Baltimore. And so you have a potential of all 6 playoff teams repeating, which I don't know the last time that has happened in favor, but New England looks like they're going to be in. Indianapolis looks like they're going to be in. Denver and San Diego from the West looks like they'll be in. It's Cincinnati, and they currently lead the AFC North with a win over the Ravens today. If they get in, and then the Chiefs, with the 6th team from the AFC playoffs last year, they're currently sitting at 4-3. It's going to be more difficult for them to get in this year with the other teams that they're facing. Baltimore is currently 5-3, Pittsburgh is 5-3, Buffalo is 5-3, the Dolphins are 4-3, the Browns are 4-3. There's much more competition for that spot this year. I don't think the Chiefs are going to get it, but you're still looking at a situation where 5 of the 6 AFC playoff teams might be repeats from last year, which, that's not what we've been seeing lately. That would be kind of an upset just right there.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, you probably only get one new team in the AFC with Baltimore, so that by itself is surprising. But I think that's enough on the AFC. As I said, we've covered that in many podcasts. If you want, go back to last week's podcast, the Week 7 podcast. It's available out on our YouTube page. You can hear our full description of what we think is going to happen with all those different scenarios for the 6th playoff spot in the AFC. But Mark, why don't you touch on the NFC? I know we kept putting this off because the NFC has been so much more convoluted. There have been a few teams that have started to separate, but when you start to get towards naming 6 teams, it got really difficult really fast. So why don't you lead us into that, and then I'll mock you afterwards.
Okay. If I had this pick 6 playoff teams from the AFC at this point, I'm going to go with the Cowboys, the Eagles, the Packers, the Cardinals, the Niners, and for a 16, I'm actually going to go with Detroit over Seattle with what I saw today. Seattle's offense is struggling, and I'm going to pick Detroit. So those are my 6 teams.
Mark, there's just one little problem. You didn't pick a team from the NFC South, and I think the rules still state that every division winner makes the playoffs.
Yeah, I just can't do it. They're so bad. They have all 4 of their teams are below 500. The division leader right now is 3-4-1. How do we give them a win spot? It just doesn't seem right.
Well, I guess what we have to hope is that they have a lot of games within the division remaining so that one of them may actually get to 500 or above. Because I think last week we did mention how horrible the NFC South was, and we failed to mention going into that all the wins that the division had within the division, You mentioned a couple of them, but I realized that we've missed a couple. So I think they'd only had 2 wins out of the division at all. Luckily, New Orleans tonight has taken care of Green Bay with the gimpy Aaron Rodgers, and so they were able to add a out of division win to the NFC South. But and to be fair, Atlanta thought they had added a win right up until that delay game penalty.
Okay. So if I must add a team from the NFC South per NFL rules, I will say Cowboys, Eagles, Packers, Saints, Cardinals, Niners. Niners are sitting at 4-3, but they're going to get healthier. They get Alden Smith back possibly as soon as this week. They're going to get Navarro Bowman back later. Patrick Willis missed the Broncos game. The Niners had a bye this week. He should be back in week 9. So they're getting healthier. Seattle is just one of those kind of, the Super Bowl curse. It's been a long time since the Super Bowl winner even won a playoff game the following year. I think they're going to miss the playoffs the way that they're playing right now. The Harvin trade, clearly Harvin wasn't doing a lot for them, but just kind of the disruption in the locker room that caused. It looks like they might miss the playoffs. They still have 2 games against the Niners. As I already said, the Niners getting healthier if they win those 2 games. I don't see Seattle getting in. In the North, Green Bay is currently 1 game behind the Lions. I know Detroit won today, and the Packers lost, and Detroit's already even beaten Green Bay head-to-head. But over the second half of the season, unless Megatron comes back and he's his normal Megatron self, then I suppose that Detroit might be able to hold off Green Bay. But if not, if he doesn't come back, or if he comes back and he's 60% of himself, 70% of himself, then I think Green Bay is going to win that division.
Interesting. I don't disagree that I think Green Bay still has a good shot to win that division. And I think the way we've been breaking out the AFC is there have been 5 teams that we felt really comfortable with, and there was a 6th spot up for grabs. In this case, I think there probably are 6, maybe 7 if you want to include Seattle, that are going for 5 spots. And then as you mentioned, obviously the NFC South gets a bid. I would agree and say it's New Orleans. They looked a little better tonight. They still have some home games coming up. And really that division's so horrible. If they can just get to 9-7, they probably win that division. So I'll give New Orleans that. I like Detroit a little more than you do, though, I think. They proved without Megatron that they could. I believe he was running dummy routes against Green Bay, and they still were able to beat the Packers. They seem to have a defensive front that can play with the Packers. I do believe that Megatron and the Decepticons will come back later this season and perform up to their evil levels that we've become accustomed to. And no Aaron Rodgers and his Autobot friends will be able to handle that. So I think Detroit actually is going to be in the playoffs this year. Jim Caldwell, as surprising as this sounds, has made them at least respectable. They don't self-destruct. They've won close games, which under Jim Schwartz never happened. So I think you get a healthy Megatron, similar to what you said about San Francisco. If you start getting healthier and you already bagged all these wins, it's a good chance for you to move forward. So I actually like Dallas and Philly. I like Detroit and Green Bay. I like New Orleans. And I like Arizona. I'm leaving out the San Francisco 49ers. It hurts me to do this because I think last week or the week before I mentioned they're getting healthier. They're going to be better as the season goes on. And yet something about that offense just bothers me. Even in weeks where it's not that the defense is giving up too many points, they just don't seem to move the ball well. Kaepernick has not progressed the way I sort of anticipated he would, especially after drafting him in multiple leagues this year. So, yeah, I'm just highly disappointed in the way the offense looks. Jim Harbaugh's situation's up in the air. I could see a couple of rough patches. They have 2 games with Seattle still to go. We've got games with Arizona. If they hit any turbulence, I could see that team getting loud, the locker room getting a little divisive, and things falling apart. And as you mentioned, Seattle, I just think they don't have it together this year. It's hard to stay super hungry and be the guys with the chip on your shoulder when everybody tells you how great you are. And even after the first week of the season, everyone told us how great Seattle was. They could go 16-0. This might be the greatest team ever. Are they better this year than last year? Well, it turns out the answers are no, 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 and no.
Yeah, you could be right. That could be interesting as far as if you're saying only one team in the NFC West, even though most people are saying that that's kind of the strongest division in the NFL right now. And then, as you said, I think we can fairly safe to say we're only going to get one team out of the NFC South, which means there's 5 other spots. And so out of Dallas, Philly, Detroit, Green Bay, Arizona, San Francisco, Seattle, those are 7 pretty good teams, good quality teams. Only 5 of those are going to get in. So 2 of those 7 teams are going to be left out. So you said it's going to be San Francisco and Seattle. I think it's going to be Detroit and Seattle. So we'll see how that plays out, but definitely an interesting playoff race in the NFC. So I guess we're pretty much writing off a couple of decent teams in the Giants and Chicago. Clearly not great teams. Clearly have some flaws, but the Giants are working at 3-4. Chicago's 3-5, so not exactly out of it yet. But I don't see either of those teams making enough of a move in the second half to even really get into the picture.
No, I mean, if you want to go by record alone, Minnesota's also 3-5 with the Bears. I don't see Minnesota getting to the playoffs either. And with a negative point differential like the Bears have, like the Vikings have, like the Giants have, and the Redskins, I'm writing those teams off. I'm writing off 3 of the 4 in the NFC South. In my mind, it's Carolina, Atlanta, and Tampa Bay. Definitely Atlanta and Tampa Bay I've written off already. St. Louis, valiant efforts every week it seems, but I've already written them off. I was close to writing Seattle off, but I'm going to leave them alive for a few more weeks because they do have enough divisional games that they can get back in this race, but obviously they don't want to stumble too many more times in the near future, or else we may start writing them off. But yeah, I agree. I think they're, as I said, they're 5 spots up for grabs when you exclude the NFC South automatic bid. I think they're a good 7 teams for it, and as opposed to the AFC where you had a lot of mediocre teams that we were talking about making that 6th spot, you're talking about some really quality teams that could do damage in the playoffs that won't be in.
Yeah, well, and looking at the Seahawks, I mentioned they're 4-3. The one thing that they really have going for them is, of course, their home field advantage. They've already lost once at home this year to the Cowboys, but this is a team that typically goes 8-0 or 7-1 at home. And when I look at the remaining home games, they've got Raiders, clearly an automatic win. They've got the Giants, that should be a win. And then they host, their 3 divisional games. They haven't hosted any of their divisional opponents yet. And so the last 2 home games are against Arizona, San Francisco, and St. Louis. They should win the St. Louis game. Arizona and San Francisco, don't know that they necessarily win both of those, but I think they at least split 1-1. So that puts them at 6-2 at home. Then if they can just go, even 5-3 on the road, even if they go 4-4 on the road, that gets them to 10 wins, maybe 11. So I think we might be a little too quick writing Seattle off just with that home field advantage. And this was their only 2nd week without Persona, and maybe once they adjust a little bit more, get the new rookie wide receivers in the mix, Richardson and Norwood, and once they get those things further out, we may still see Seattle in the playoff race too.
Yeah, I don't want to completely write them off yet either. But like I said, if they stumble in the next couple weeks, especially, as you pointed out, they have that great home field advantage, but if they stumble at home again, and Arizona did beat them in Seattle last year, so that's no gimme. San Francisco always plays them tough. So while they do have the Raiders, the bye week, after the bye week, they also have to play some tough divisional opponents. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in the NFC, because I do feel like we're going to end up just like last year where you had a 10-6 team in Arizona who doesn't qualify for the playoffs, and you feel like they would be better than 2 or 3 of the teams in the AFC playoffs.
Yeah, I could easily see that happening. I could easily see a repeat of last year where a 10-6 team misses the playoffs at the expense, in this case, of an NFC South team that gets in at 9-7 or possibly even 8-8 or 8-7-1 or something with the Panthers involved with their tie. So, yeah, we'll see how that shakes out. So that's kind of our recap or analysis of the NFL at the halfway point. And from a fantasy standpoint, who would you say are some of the positional fantasy MVPs at the halfway point?
Well, I'll take the quarterback position and then throw it back to you for running back, and we can discuss receiver after that. But from a quarterback position, I think hands down there's one clear-cut player that would be the fantasy MVP. It's not just based on production, which has been off the charts, but also value in the draft. And we talked about this in our quarter point, and not much has changed. Andrew Luck still running away with the QB position. Not only does he lead the league in passing yards, averaging 341 yards per game, which is significantly higher than the second best player in the league. But I mean, he's consistently doing this week in, week out. He's spreading the ball around. He gives you some of the rushing stats as well. I mean, the man has just been a remarkable fantasy find. And again, you probably picked him up in the 4th or 5th round, which is, again, just makes your team so much better if you've added that first round running back or receiver, and then you flipped to the other position in the 2nd round. And in the 3rd round, you firm up your running back position. Then in the 4th round, you get Luck or a receiver and get Luck in the 5th round. Your roster is just so much better by getting Andrew Luck that late as opposed to grabbing maybe the 2nd or 3rd best quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective, which would be someone like a Peyton Manning or an Aaron Rodgers, who both produced fairly well this year. You can't complain too much about their production, but you probably took them in the 1st or early 2nd round. So a little harder to give them the MVP. A couple other guys that have either not produced to where I would have expected or might have surprised a little. Obviously, I mentioned Colin Kaepernick. There was some thought this might be a big breakout year for him. I don't think I've seen that yet. Very disappointing. Nick Foles, nobody expected him to do the 27 touchdowns, 2 interceptions this year, but quite a slow start for Nick. Most of Philadelphia's offense, honestly, has been slow starting. LaShawn McCoy hasn't been tearing things up prior to week 7, so I think that has something to do with it as well. So those guys were both a little behind where you would have liked them. And Matt Stafford, without Megatron, he is not a elite fantasy quarterback. He's more of an average fantasy quarterback. Another guy that's outproduced his draft position, but that's probably because you drafted him as a backup, was Ben Roethlisberger. Now, today's 500-yard performance goes a long way towards his season-long stats, but he is sitting up there 2nd in yards, and he's putting together a respectable year. And again, you probably drafted Ben to be a QB2, maybe one of the first backups drafted. He might have been sitting around 12, 13, 14 on most QB boards. And right now he's definitely qualifying as a QB1 and should be starting in most leagues unless you took him to back up a Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees type. So that's my recap of the QBs. Anything you want to add there, Mark?
No, I would 100% agree on Luck, and that's not just us being biased as Colts fans. He's putting up ridiculous numbers. I have him in one of my leagues. I, start him with, no qualms, no questions. Don't even look at the matchup. Doesn't even matter who they're playing. You're going to start Luck. I don't even have a backup QB in that league, actually. His bye week is coming up fairly soon, in week 10. I'll just find someone off the waivers to plug in for 1 week. But, but the numbers he's putting up, he was drafted, I think, in probably round 4 or 5 of most drafts this year. I think he'll probably end up going, late 1st round, early 2nd round next year. He's clearly, I think, made a leap this year. And the other part of it is that they're leading the league in plays per game. So, he's a great quarterback, makes good decisions, but then also with the fact that he's just getting more plays per game than anyone else strongly leads to his stats. And then with Roethlisberger, I think a lot of people might have shied away from him a little bit this year because they lost, 2 of the top 3 receivers in the offseason. They lost Emmanuel Sanders, they lost Jericho Cotchery, and they didn't do a whole lot to replace them. They drafted, Martavis Bryant out of Clemson, I think, in the 4th round. But people are saying that he's kind of raw, not sure what he'll do this year. And then they brought in Lance Moore, who I think is, 47 years old, from the Saints. And so I think people are a little bit worried about who's he going to throw to. Speaking of old players, Heath Miller is still the tight end for the 23rd consecutive season. But he's made it work. I mean, he obviously has a clear-cut number 1 in Antonio Brown, stud wide receiver. But then, Martavis Bryant, the last couple weeks, has put up some good numbers. And Marcus Wheaton, the second-year player, has been kind of hit or miss, but he's been fairly productive as well. So Big Ben has made it work, and he's definitely been a good value. But, I have to agree that Luck has been the fantasy MVP from a QB standpoint this year. If we go into the running back position, another one that I think is fairly easy, Marco Murray, putting up, historic numbers. First person to ever have 100 more yards for the first 7 games of the season. He's probably going to make it 8 when he plays Washington on Monday night. He's just having a ridiculous season. I think at this point he's almost to 1,000 already. He has like 913, I think. He'll get over 1,000 against Washington. We'll see how many he gets. He might be right around the pace to break the record of 2105. So depending on how much Dallas wants to use him in the second half of the season. But DeMarco Murray, I think in most drafts was probably kind of a mid-second round guy. Maybe the 5th, 6th, or probably even more than that, 7th, 8th running back of the board or something like that. And yet, putting up numbers better than any other running back out there. And clearly there's been some disappointments at the running back position this year. Marshawn Lynch has not put up the numbers that people expected. He was a first-round pick in most drafts. We don't even need to mention Peterson and Rice. Clearly there's disappointments there. And then Eddie Lacy. Eddie Lacy was mid-first round in most drafts. He's been pretty disappointing so far, especially from a rushing standpoint. And yet, weirdly, in the game tonight, I think he had around 12 receptions, which I'm going to go out on the limb and say is more receptions than he's ever had in any game in his life. I guess I shouldn't necessarily rule out high school, but definitely from a pro or college perspective. So he definitely was productive tonight from that standpoint, but overall for the season has been giving you a little bit less than what you expected if you took him in the middle of the first round.
Yeah, definitely Lacy's been a disappointment. I think I mentioned earlier, LaShawn McCoy, he was probably taken first overall, if not, second, maybe in some drafts, but he's not lived up to that billing so far. So I think, again, DeMarco Murray, clear-cut MVP from the running back position. Since I own him in our league, as you know, I've been riding him pretty heavily. I'm going to, like the Cowboys, ride him until he breaks apart. And it's got me all the way up to the top of the league, so I'm not going to complain yet. Another running back I think that we didn't mention that's probably second or third in running back MVP voting would be Arian Foster. Now, I think the knock and the worry on Foster was injuries. Everybody knows that. Everybody was shying away from him because this is the year he's going to break down. He's only going to be a split time back. They can't possibly keep running him like they did before because he's just not going to survive. Well, it turns out so far for half a season he has survived. He's thrived. He's actually second in the league in rushing. He's getting touchdowns at a good clip. So, obviously you got Arian Foster even later than DeMarco Murray. You probably got him tail end of the second round or even into the third round. And that's quite a lot of value. Now, again, these are halfway point MVPs. The reason they don't get the award now is because there's still another half of the season to go. So Murray needs to keep on his pace. Foster has to stay healthy. There's still time for McCoy to come back and put up some better numbers and maybe salvage a season. Same with Lacy. If he continues catching the ball like you say he did tonight, Mark, maybe get some of the rushing going. So there's time to salvage some of those seasons. Matt Forte could perhaps produce more. Maybe they'll lean on him to get the Chicago ship righted. Few, as you mentioned, like Adrian Peterson, you can't salvage that season. But I think there's time to salvage some. But from an MVP standpoint, unless something happens, Murray is taking this and running with it. Pun fully intended.
Well, that's a good point on Foster. He's someone that, in my drafts, I know that I was kind of avoiding unless he somehow fell to, late third round or fourth round somehow. But I think he was typically going in kind of mid to late second round. And just based on his injury history, and he's a little bit older, I think he's pushing 30, and just was a player that I was not really interested in taking this year. Another disappointment that we haven't mentioned yet was Multiplier. He also was taken, I think, around the second round of most drafts. And granted, he has an injury. He's been out with the last few weeks, but even before that, he just wasn't looking great. And the way that Wally Hellman has now been running behind that same offensive line that Multiplier wasn't really doing anything with, even when Ball does come back, there's a lot of speculation. He probably won't get the carries back. If anything, it'll be kind of a split with Hellman. So that's definitely been a different disappointing situation. And then just to fact check myself here, I looked at the box score, and anyways, he didn't have quite as many receptions as I thought. He had 8 receptions, but he had a few right near the end that made it seem like more. But he had 123 yards, which 122 receiving yards regularly. I'll say that similar to my statement where I thought he had more catches, probably the most receiving yards that he's ever had in a given game, either in college or pro. With the running back pretty much wrapped up, why don't you get us started on the wide receiver fantasy MVP?
Yeah, so this is probably the closest of them. I mean, so far we had clear-cut Andrew Luck and DeMarco Murray as winners. The fantasy wide receiver, no one player has pulled away so much that you could say it's an inarguable win. So there were a couple of good names that I think we threw about here, but I think I settled on Antonio Brown. As you mentioned earlier, Roethlisberger's numbers have been mainly because he has a clear number one to throw to, and that number one is Antonio Brown. He's been putting up some great numbers. He's already at 60 catches. He's over 800 yards. He's got 7 touchdowns. So I think just the complete package, the catches, the yards, the touchdowns, it's all there. He even gets some rushes, and on the odd chance that he returns a punt for a touchdown as their punt returner, and you get that in your league, he could even be adding value there for you. So I think I'm going to have to go with Brown as the fantasy wide receiver MVP at the halfway point. A couple of other names we considered. T.Y. Hilton, leading the league in receiving yards through 8 weeks. He has been on fire the last couple of weeks. The one thing that holds him back, he's got the 55 catches, the 850-plus yards, but he's only got the 2 TDs. So that kind of has hurt him. Now, they both have come in the last few weeks, so that helped. So he's starting to trend in the right direction. But at a halfway point, I'd put him a peg below Antonio Brown just due to the touchdowns. Jordy Nelson has had a nice start, although tonight definitely didn't enhance his situation. But there's another player that you probably were able to get with a late second-round pick. Brown, Nelson, T.Y. Hilton was probably a fifth-round pick. So from a value perspective, he probably would have been the best of the bunch. But Brown, you probably got tail end of the second round, early third round, probably going off the board as the 8th or 9th wide receiver. So I think that's why when you combine the fact that he's probably the highest scoring wide receiver with the fact that you didn't take him where you took Megatron or A.J. Green or Demaryius Thomas, you probably feel pretty good about having him on your team and having him as your wide receiver MVP.
Yeah, I agree with that. He's putting up some great numbers, and then you kind of mentioned those guys near the end there as far as potential disappointments. Obviously, Megatron with the injuries, and not even just the injuries. At least the games that he's been declared inactive, you know not to put him in your starting lineup. But there were a couple weeks there, weeks 3 and 4, where they said he was active and he was going to play, and you're in a situation where it's Megatron, so if he's active, you pretty much have to put him in your starting lineup. And they're pretty much just using him as a decoy. And you got literally hardly anything out of him. I think he had like 1 catch for 10 yards, something like that in each of those games. So definitely hurting you from a fantasy standpoint. A.J. Green also has missed some time. He had a game where, he didn't really do much of anything, and he's missed a few games. And during his comments, you mentioned he's had a pretty good season so far. Emmanuel Sanders, another guy that's probably outperformed his draft position.
Yeah. Again, wide receiver, a number of players have been performing well. As you mentioned, a few were busts as well. But I think it's probably the most competitive. And by the end of the season, I'm certain that we may have someone new instead of Antonio Brown. And we won't mention the same names. Golden Tate could slide in there if Megatron continues missing time. Golden Tate's been putting up good numbers. So, and a whole host of players, I think, that by the end of the year could be the fantasy wide receiver MVP. But similar to that, I think we can move on to the fantasy tight end of the halfway MVP point. So, Mark, why don't you lead us through there and see, is it a competitive category or is it someone running away with it?
I would say for top 3, based on production and value, based on where you pick them, I would say the top one is probably Antonio Gates. He's just put up some really good numbers so far. He already has 417 receiving yards, but most importantly, he has 9 touchdowns. So he is averaging more than a touchdown per game. Clearly, that's pretty good. He's had a 2-touchdown game and a 3-touchdown game. So, and especially where he was drafted. He was drafted pretty late in most drafts. He was drafted as basically a tight end backup for your team. I think in a lot of drafts he was drafted behind Ladarius Green. People thought that, this was the year that Ladarius Green was going to break out, and that Antonio Gates would kind of become the backup to Ladarius Green, and that turned out to be completely not the case. Antonio Gates is definitely still the starter and definitely still putting up, great numbers. In fact, I think he's on pace for probably the best season of his career, which is saying something because, he could be a potential Hall of Fame tight end when everything is said and done. It clearly looks that way. So for this to be his best season at this age is clearly saying something. A couple other candidates, Greg Olson has put up some pretty good numbers so far, and he was probably drafted as probably the, maybe 7th or 8th tight end, somewhere in that range. But he's put up some pretty good numbers. And then Martellus Bennett as well. He's probably drafted somewhere right around the same range that Greg Olson was. But he's also putting up some pretty good numbers. Markowski had a huge game today with 3 touchdowns and over 100 yards. But he was drafted probably in the 2nd round in most leagues. So he's had some pretty good production. But again, kind of in line with where he was drafted. And then Randy Walker has had a decent season. Jimmy Graham, of course, you need to touch on him. He was picked in the 1st round in most drafts, and he's had a little bit of an injury issue. Last week he was active again. So what a Megatron if he's active. He pretty much got a plan, but he did nothing. No receptions last week, and then he was back tonight playing and producing. Had a touchdown tonight, so he's put up some decent stats this year, but probably not what you expected when you drafted him in the 1st round overall.
Yeah, when Jimmy Graham and Antonio Gates have the same yards, but Gates has 9 touchdowns to Graham's 4, and you took 1 in the 1st round and 1 in the, say, 12th round, yeah, you probably didn't get the production you expected out of Jimmy Graham. Gronk's an interesting case, as you mentioned, Mark. I mean, today, he had the huge day. But if you go beyond that, he hadn't really been producing too much. I mean, obviously 150 and 3 touches today makes up for a lot. But I like to think of that as the Chris Johnson style of fantasy football. Chris Johnson would end the season with 1,500 yards and 8 touchdowns. And on a seasonal basis, you'd look at it and you say, oh, wow, he was like maybe the 12th best running back. But he did all of it in 4 games. And normally it was against the Raiders and other teams. So he would get all these stats. He would have his 3-touchdown, 220-yard game. And so I tend to avoid those players because it's so nice at the end of the season to say, wow, I had a 1,500-yard rusher. But if you really had 4 games of an 800-yard rusher and then 10 games of a 60-yard per game rusher, you don't feel quite as good about that guy.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And this looked like a game where the Patriots could have pretty much named their number against the Bears. I think if they wanted to, they could have gotten Gronk with 5 touchdowns today. So it's just one of those games that happens every now and then. You have games where you see players that just put up ridiculous stats, and the next week they're down to their normal stats. And it's quite possible that Gronk will have another 100 yards and 2 touchdowns next week, or it's possible that he'll have 6 catches for 50 yards and no touchdowns. We'll see. But he's got decent production, like you said. He was drafted probably 2nd round in most leagues, so he's gotten you pretty much kind of what you were hoping to get.
All right, well, that takes us through. I'm not going to spend any time on kicker and D. You can make one up if you like. If you're listening at home, feel free to look up the stats for the high-scoring kicker and assume that's who we picked. And for the high-scoring defense, I'm fairly certain I agree completely with your logic there.
Absolutely, except if you took a kicker before the last round, then I'm automatically excluding him from fantasy kicker MVPs whatsoever. It has to be someone that you took in the last round of the draft.
Yeah, I almost think that hurts Gostkowski. He actually will put up good numbers, but because all the magazines and all the draft sites put him as the highest kicker, some idiot in your draft probably jumped in and took him 3 rounds or 4 rounds before the end, and he's automatically disqualified from being the value kicker of the year. No MVP for you. Sorry, Steven. Again, friend of the podcast, Steven Gostkowski. And with that, Mark, I think we've wrapped up our halfway point discussion, and I think it's time for our new weekly segment we introduced last week. I like to refer to it as the highlight of my week. Here it is, Hef's Hates.
Today, I'm going to focus on, last week I had something fantasy related. This week, I'm not. I'll kind of go back and forth between the two. Sometimes it will be fantasy related, sometimes completely not. And this time it's completely not. So this one is related to restaurant menus. So I had a situation, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. I'm playing poker at a poker room here in California that we have. And I get a menu, and I see something that I like. It's a Hawaiian dish, and I call it Moco Moco, but it lists all the ingredients. It's basically a bed of rice with some hamburger patties, some onion gravy, and there's a fried egg, and there's some onions. Anyway, it lists like 6 or 7 different ingredients. And then it comes to me, and so I order it just as it is on the menu. I'll take this, please. 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, they come out and deliver it to me. It's exactly as was described on the menu, except for it's also covered in these big, huge mushrooms. Not a fan of mushrooms. I don't want your fungus all over my food.
No, that's fungi.
Fungi, yes. I don't want your fungi all over my food. And so the Hef's hate here is that if you're going to list all these ingredients, why do you leave off one? If you're going to list 7 things, okay, here are the 7 things on this dish. Oh, by the way, there's this 8th thing that we just chose to not mention on the menu. Why would you do that? Like, just list everything that's on there. And then I can just simply say, leave your fungi off my plate, and then we're all good. Because now I have to pick your fungi off my plate because I'm eating it, and the restaurant just wasted those. You know, it was a lost expense. They could have kept those. They could have kept their fungus to themselves and served it to someone else. So that is this week's edition of Hef's Hates.
All right. Well, apparently you are not only a picky eater, but very particular about your menu literature. So make note of that, all you restaurateurs out there. Heflin will come after you if you choose to list ingredients and do not list all of them properly.
Correct.
Another rousing rendition of Hef's Hates. I can't wait for next week, where it may be fantasy focused again, or it may teach me a lesson about menu etiquette. And with that, we'll move to our other weekly segment, the Multiplier and Multiply of the Week. So Mark, I'll start, and I will list off our Multiplier of the Week. This is the award that goes out to the person that multiplied a player who outperformed expectation and really was well timed. And for this week, I'm throwing it out to Martellus Bennett. The Bears tight end went for 6 catches, 95 yards, and a touchdown. That's a good stat line, as you imagine. 6 catches, 95 yards, a TD. Hey, that's good for any receiver, but he's a tight end. And the key there is there are often times that I won't multiply a tight end the entire season. Even if I get one of the better tight ends, and I have Antonio Gates, it's hard to pick when you're going to multiply a tight end. Tight ends oftentimes are just touchdown machines. There are the few exceptions where if you drafted Jimmy Graham or Julius Thomas or Gronkowski, you're probably planning to multiply them at some point. But beyond that, a tight end is a really tough position to multiply. And to not only multiply it, but to hit a week where you're going to get a 695 and a score as your stat line, well, that is just well done. So congratulations, Martellus Bennett, the Multiplier of the Week. And Mark, why don't you inform me who the Multiply of the Week is?
Well, for the Multiply of the Week, we had quite a few candidates. It was actually a pretty bad week of multiplier selections. So just a few examples of people that did not even merit Multiply of the Week, but came close, just to give you an idea of how bad things were. Brian Quick, not a good stat line. Joe Flacco, not a whole lot of yards today, 0 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, really for a bad multiplier this week. And then Andrew Corliss, tight end for the Packers, not quite sure what this team had going on, if they had some roster management situations, or maybe they just thought that Packers fans would be high scoring, and maybe Corliss would get a piece of that action, but not a lot of action on stats for Andrew tonight. But we have a 2-way tie for the Multiply of the Week, and it's Torrey Smith and Michael Ford. Both of whom had 0 receptions for 0 yards, I know Torrey Smith left the game at some point and had to go concussion protocol. I don't believe he returned. And Michael Floyd, as far as I know, did not leave the game for injury at any point. That's just this was not part of the game plan. Fitzgerald had a good day, and but Floyd did nothing. So there were two multipliers for which you got 0 points, therefore earning the Multiplier of the week.
Yes, thank you, Torrey Smith and Michael Floyd, for your 0.0 Blutarski contribution to fantasy football this week. And with that, I will ask you one more time, Mark, to help with a weekly segment before we sign off. For those that are in survivor pools, we're heading into week 9. Any insight into what games we may want to be putting our survivor picks on here coming up?
I do, but it's one of those weeks where it's almost not even worth mentioning because you have some weeks, like last week was actually a little bit more difficult to come up with one. This week, and I would say in a typical NFL week, you may have one game that has a point spread in double digits of 10 or more. Probably an average of one a week. This week, week 9, upcoming week, there are 4 of them. 4. So you've got the Jets at the Chiefs. Chiefs are a 10-point favorite. You've got the Jaguars at the Bengals. A little cat-on-cat action there. Bengals are a 12.5-point favorite. You've got the Rams at the Niners, which I seem to remember them playing on Monday night very recently. And the Niners are a 10-point favorite there. Then you have the stone-cold red-pipe lock of the century, the Raiders at the Seahawks. I know we just mentioned earlier about the Seahawks are having some troubles, but then we also said they're tough at home. They're at home against the 0-7, very, very, very bad Raiders. The Seahawks are a 14.5-point favorite. I think you could choose any one of those 4. If you're in a league where you can't pick a team more than once, maybe you already used Seattle. As far as a team that maybe you haven't used yet, I would say, if you haven't used the Chiefs, they're at home against the Jets. The Jets are a team in disarray. That seems fairly safe. And then if you haven't used the Bengals yet, at home against the Jaguars, that seems like a sure thing as well. So you definitely have quite a few options, much more so than a typical week.
Yeah, and I know from my experience in the survivor pools in the past couple weeks, this past week was pretty difficult comparatively. I did see a lot of people getting by with Miami at Jacksonville, a lot of people taking KC, trusting that they would beat St. Louis at home, or Cleveland holding off the Raiders. And luckily for all of them, and for me, those teams did hold out. And so now you might have been holding Seattle specifically for this spot. I tend to find that means that there won't be a lot of players eliminated in the upcoming week, because most people that have Seattle will use them this week. And as we both will assume, Seattle is not going to lose at home to Oakland. So this isn't the week to win your survivor pool, but it's probably a good week to avoid losing it.
Yeah, and the other crazy thing, not only is there other 4 games that are double-digit favorites, but I should mention as well that next week there are 6 teams on bye. So 6 teams on bye, there's only 13 games in total in week 9, and yet 4 of them, according to Vegas, are going to be blowouts. So maybe not the best week of NFL football ever. But speaking of bye, not quite sure what the NFL is doing when they put a bunch of teams on bye in week 4. I think that's 6 teams on bye in week 4, which is very early. And then 2 teams each week on bye in weeks 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then now 6 teams on bye this coming week, and 6 teams on bye in week 10. So, make sure as you're doing your free agency ad drop bids for this week, pay attention to your lineup. Make sure you realize that there are 6 different teams on bye this week, so you need to manage your roster accordingly.
Yeah, you'd think the NFL might figure out a way to smooth that out so it's not 6-2-2-2-2-2-6-6, but be that as it may, as you point out, this is a week to watch your roster as you move into weeks 9 and 10, and we start to fade away from the big slate of games and move into the smaller slate thanks to the 6 teams on bye. And then, funnily enough, after the week 10, there'll still be a couple weeks of byes with 2 teams on bye. So, well done, NFL. Way to make this very consistent and very easy for the fantasy player in the world to manage through.
Yeah, they definitely need to take a look at that for next year. Maybe we can write a letter to Mr. Goodell and say, hey, I know you have plenty of issues on your plate, but can you please look at the bye week issues?
Well, maybe we'll send it to Jeff Miller, head of security for the NFL. I've got an in.
Yes, yeah, you've got the famous George Costanza and I've got the same name.
Whatever works, Mark. Whatever works. All right, with that, I think we've come to the end of another successful podcast. So, wrapping up the Week 8 podcast, remember to go check out the website, steelscorpionsports.com. We're a better species of fantasy football. We've got the mulligans, the multipliers, the all-play format. Check out the website, tell your friends about us, and definitely come back and check out the podcast next week. We'll have more of Hef's Hates, more of our Multiplier, Multiplier of the week, and more Survivor picks, along with gambling tidbits, news from around the NFL and the fantasy world. So signing off from San Diego, I'm Jeff Miller.
Signing off from San Jose, I'm Mark Heffel.
We'll talk to you next week, sports fans.